past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon and welcome back. The Eurasian Times reports F-16 pilot killed as Ukraine confirms another loss of fighting Falcon. No clarity on who shot it down, Kiev or Moscow. Ukraine has confirmed the loss of another F-16 fighter jet during combat operations in the country's eastern region, while the Bulgarian military.com reports President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses the loss, stating that military reports are being prepared to clarify the circumstances, though he withheld further details. The Ukraine conflict has been off the Western media radar for quite some time. What's happening in the region? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is Ukraine has lost another F-16 and pilot yesterday. Russian forces also hit the site of a meeting of Ukrainian command staff in the city of Sumy with Iskander cruise missiles, killing 60 service people. And then earlier today, Russian forces struck Ukrainian army personnel and foreign mercenaries in 137 areas over the past day in the special military operation in Ukraine. They're not talking about it here, but it appears as though Ukraine is still catching hell over there. My guest is a Moscow-based international relations and security analyst, Mark Sleboda. Mark, welcome back, man. It has been too long. Welcome back.
Dr. Leon, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Connecting the Dots.
So before we get to the F-16 issue, and it has been a while since we've talked, is there any update or clarification on the story from, I guess it was last month, on the Putin motorcade limo catching fire in central Moscow?
Yeah, that's a fake news story. There was an Oris limousine that caught fire in Sretenka Street in downtown Moscow, but it was not Putin's, had nothing to do with the government. It was a privately owned vehicle.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that clarification. And seeing as that story came and went as quickly as it did, the bad story tended to be my conclusion.
The wishful thinking of the British press that Putin had died or an assassination attempt. It turns out just to be tabloid news.
Okay, thank you very much for that update. So let's get to the F-16 issue. Ukraine has lost its second F-16 and pilot. What is your understanding?
Okay, so you might remember that F-16s have been sent to the Kiev regime in Ukraine to replace the almost complete elimination of their own air force, which numbered above 300 aircraft at the start of this conflict. There isn't a definitive word on how many have been transferred. They have not been transferred from the United States, although the U.S. had to give permission. They were transferred from Denmark, the Netherlands, possibly Norway, but from European countries. These were old F-16s that were due for mothballing, were due for retirement anyway. And these countries agreed to send them in return, I understand, for a sweetheart deal on the F-35s. Although, considering the F-35's track record, I'm not so sure that was necessarily such a good deal. But
is that the flying piano?
Yeah, that's
the F-35.
It is
the
F-35
is a flying piano.
It is a flying boondoggle. That is for sure. So less than 50, right? Probably considerably less, but there's supposed to be a chain of them. Interestingly enough, the French government has also sent a number of French Mirage 2000s, another aircraft that was literally undergoing mothballing. It was not on active service. Sending both of these Western aircraft with radically different designs, maintenance requirements, parts, absolutely nothing is interoperable between them, really increases the logistics burden on this. The Kiev regime, of course, does not only have pilots that are not trained or not really trained to fly these aircraft and have no experience using them in combat, but they also have no personnel, capable of supplying the daily maintenance for keeping these maintenance-heavy aircraft in the air, which means that they're probably undergo a considerable amount of maintenance from Western, experts, mercenaries, volunteers, guys definitely not wearing boots, but ballet slippers or whatever you want to call them in the country. For the most part, these aircraft have not been used in combat. There have been actually in an interview with the head of the Kiev regime's Air Force, he openly talked about how these aircraft are simply not capable of going up against modern Russian aircraft. They're outranged, they're outradared. The missiles go much further. They're simply not really capable of that. What they are primarily being used for is an air defense role. The Kiev regime, of course, has huge problems with air defense. Recent missile and drone strikes on the country in the last couple of months have demonstrated that, for the most part, the Kiev regime has effectively no air defense left. No matter the number of Patriots, NASAMs, Iris-Ts that have been sent by the U.S., Europe, or Germany, that these systems are taken out almost as fast as they are sent. So in an attempt to ameliorate that to some condition, these aircraft are often sent on missions to try to bring down drones or slower moving, older cruise missiles and the like. Now, of course, the Kiev regime reports fabulous success with them, but there's really no guarantee of that. So my understanding that this second F-16 went down in a mission, in air defense mission over Kiev itself, over the capital. Now it was supposedly attempting to bring down drones, long-range Russian drones like the Gran 2 Black. Now, there is two different competing stories out there. One, it was brought down by the Kiev regime's own a remnant air defense, which would raise serious questions. Functionality of the identify friend or foe circuitry that is supposed to be part of such aircraft and the air defense systems that the West has supplied, and that's certainly not questions that the West wants to answer about that. So that is one story. The other story is that it was brought down by a long-range Russian air defense system, the S-400. It would be at the far end of its range, but it's possible that could have been positioned specifically to hunt for such aircraft used in that role. We don't have an official word yet. We do have a word that the F-16 was downed and that the pilot was lost. That's all we know for absolute certainty.
You touched on this in that description, and thank you. That was very complete as always. From the time they started talking about sending these F-16s into the country, there was discussion about a problem with training the pilots. That to your point, the aircrafts are old. The pilots are used to, I think, flying Russian MiG aircraft, not F-16s. You've got a language issue. You've got a maintenance issue. And I've learned from you that the low hanging nature of the F-16 engine means that it sucks up all the debris that's on the runway. So it needs a pristine runway. I remember you saying to me at one point, you even have people out there with brooms literally sweeping the runway because this thing just sucks up all the debris in its path. How much of this do you attribute to poor pilot training?
I mean, there's no question that there's no way that these pilots were trained to use these aircraft effectively. Certainly not in combat. They haven't been used in a whole lot of, what we would consider. I mean, they're not engaging in dogfights against more advanced, newer Russian aircraft. That's for sure. Romania has been transitioning from a Soviet legacy aircraft systems, MiGs, to the F-16. And before, it's already a couple years ago now, before the Kiev regime received the first of these F-16s, in an Air Force publication, there was an excellent article talking about the Romanians' transitions and what, the lessons that they have learned could be used, for Ukraine, for the Kiev regime, making that transition for its Air Force to F-16s and other Western aircraft. And the Romanian lessons was basically, we've been working on it for 8 years and we're almost there. Almost there, right? Almost we can fly these things effectively and use them in combat. So that should right away give you a clue of what's going on. I mean, you can always say it's a war, you go in with what you got or what you got along the way, I guess. In this one, and you make the best, but they've essentially lost their own domestic Air Force, their Soviet legacy Air Force at this point. So it's not like they really have a choice. The first F-16 that was downed, there is no definitive story of how it happened, but I think that there is probably the closest to a consensus is that that was pilot error, that was due to not being able to properly, not having the experience to fly this aircraft. And this mission, again, without knowing whether it was a Russian anti-aircraft missile, or whether it was one of the Kiev regime's own and some type of failure of the IFF, it's really tough to say whether pilot error was directly involved or not. I mean, but there overall, there is no question that these pilots, the U.S. and other European countries that train them, they struggled just to teach them enough English to learn the most basic vocabulary for instruction, right? Instruction, teaching them in Ukrainian wasn't really possible. And although they all supposedly spoke some level of English, or most of them did before they underwent this training, it obviously was deemed not enough to even begin the book work. So lots of problems with the training process. And this has been quietly reported in the Western media as well, that the training process was extremely problematic and with, shall we say, limited results. And of course, that will have an effect on their performance, whether that, lack of real experience and pilot training was directly responsible for this particular incident or not. We can't say for sure, but we can venture that it certainly didn't help matters.
As I mentioned in the open, Russian forces hit the site of a meeting of Ukraine command staff in the city of Sumy with Iskander missiles. So in terms of this missile strike, it's reported, quote, yesterday, under the conditions of active counteraction of Ukrainian troops by foreign-made electronic warfare and air defense means, the Russian armed forces carried out a strike on the site of a meeting of the Seversky Tactical and Operations Command's leadership in Sumy, using 2 Iskander-M operational tactical complexes. How significant of a strike is this, Mark Sleboda?
It was for the Russian military, according to the reports we've gotten so far, it was a good hit. The Kiev regime evidently, or at least the local military officials in Sumy, were conducting an awards ceremony, which gathering large numbers of troops and officers together in one place for such a, particularly, shall we say, a non-essential purpose in a place. Sumy is extremely close to the front lines at this point, because Sumy is a region in the northeast of Ukraine, an oblast. It is the region from which the Kiev regime launched its now failed Kursk incursion. In fact, it's entirely possible that some of those troops being presented rewards were being, quote, rewarded for surviving Kursk, I guess, like a t-shirt. I invaded Kursk and all I got was this lousy t-shirt and the entire rest of my brigade wiped out.
And a missile in my ear.
Yeah. So Russian, they held this. Evidently, it was held in the open on a street. And of course, Russian intelligence found out about it, and they did not hesitate. Particularly, I would guess that, the number of officers that could have been involved in this, and doubly so if they had been involved in the Kursk incursion, which Russian government has made a lot of noise about alleged Kiev regime troop war criminals wiping out, particularly the men, but also in some cases women, children, rape, torture of the inhabitants of these small Russian villages that they invaded in the Kursk region. There's not a lot of sympathy or mercy, shall we say, for them at this point. The Kiev regime is waffling on this story. It follows in a missile attack just a week ago in the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rog, actually the Kiev regime leader's Zelensky's hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And according to the Kiev regime accounts that have been duly stenographed in the Washington Post and other sources, these ballistic missiles, which we were told repeatedly throughout this conflict, are of limited supply, and that Russia can't make any more, and they're almost out of missiles, which of course never turned out to be true. But we could assume still that they're, not something you use on a non-essential target. Anyway, according to the Kiev regime, Russia targeted a playground. That was because it's well known that Russian missiles only strike playgrounds, kindergartens, hospitals, and kitten and puppy rescue centers.
Oh, right? And not only hospitals, but maternity wards.
Maternity wards, yes, of course. So, I mean, that's just the orcs that Russians are. Anyway, the Russian story of this strike is somewhat different. That there was a meeting of Kiev regime military officers with a number of Western quote unquote mercenary instructors. So Western military people. They were at a restaurant. And Russia targeted it. Now, of course,
we've heard that Russian restaurant. I mean, we've heard that restaurant story before. A number of Ukrainian officers were at a pizza place.
Yes.
And they were using their WhatsApp or Find Me telephone apps, and a missile found them.
Yes. The Kiev regime, similarly in that situation, tried to deny those stories, and this was just a case of Russian forces targeting pizza places with ballistic missiles, high priority target pizza places. But I think that the overwhelming evidence and reports from Western volunteers, mercenaries from the incident pretty much conclusively lend greater credence to the Russian interpretation of events. So one thing you can say is that Russia targeting a restaurant where there was a lot of Kiev regime and Western military is risking civilian casualties, right? There's no question about that, right? That no different than when the United States, Donald Trump is dropping bombs in Yemen, right, on Yemeni citizens, right? It's up to the militaries to, and then the eventual political sign off to make the judgment call of proportionality, whether the potential military benefits outweigh the potential for civilian casualties. One thing I would say is that both of these strikes that Russia made in the last, I mean, they've made lots of other strikes, but these two gathered the most news because there were obviously both high casualty events, is that Russia appears to be, shall we say, widening the aperture, or you want to say lowering the threshold for making the judgment call of making such strikes. In other words, it appears that they are escalating the conflict, that they are more willing to make such strikes in order to, I would guess, primarily bring their point home to Western countries that continue to provide military aid, military quote experts and trainers to this conflict, particularly in light of Trump at least rhetorically claiming that he wants to end the conflict, that he wants peace. Well, of course, everyone wants peace, but the truth is that everyone wants peace on their terms, and that's it. So that's no different for the Russian government, the Kiev regime, or Donald Trump's administration.
Does this signal to you, along with the escalation, the escalatory nature of this, about intel, about Russia's ability to gather intel and Russia's ability to strike on that intel in an incredibly, what seems to be incredibly short amounts of time and in very, very lethal manners?
Yeah, this has been reported on again in passing, hidden in articles in the Western media over the last few years that Russia, one, has always had very good intelligence, be that from signals intelligence, human intelligence of events, in the Kiev regime. So I guess the key point is acting on it and on how fast they're acting on it. And these Western reports have grudgingly acknowledged that Russia's chain, right? You want to call it a decision chain or a kill chain to finding out that intel and then acting on it, targeting it, and following through with engagement has shortened and is, shall we say, of an admirable level of a concise period of time that they're able to find that intelligence and act on it.
In fact, and please forgive me if this is a totally stupid question. Do you have just a general a swag, how long it takes from the time they say, hey, there's this award ceremony happening in the middle of the street, from that moment to somebody getting a missile in their ear?
Okay, so I mean, with that award ceremony, that's probably something that Russia had intelligence a significant amount of time before that event. So maybe that's not, I mean, that's something that would have been arranged. Maybe that's not the best example. But for, shall we say, command groupings arriving at a particular command center close to the front line or something like that, I think that Russian chain of events, leading to striking them with ballistic missiles, or primarily here we're talking about Iskander ballistic missiles. The Russian production of them seems to be through the roof. They're very, very eager to use them, and they've gotten very good results to them. You can consider it roughly analogous to the ATACMS missile that the U.S. provided to the Kiev regime. Not exactly, but it's close enough for discussion purposes. I would say that it definitely that Russia can get that response within a couple of hours, and in the best case scenarios, less than an hour.
Wow. Okay. And there's one more point here. Operational tactical aircraft attack unmanned aerial vehicles, missile troops, and artillery of the Russian groups of forces struck the workshops of a Ukrainian industrial enterprise. I think this is from TASS. The infrastructure of a military airfield, armament and ammunition storage sites of the Ukrainian army, and temporary deployment areas of Ukraine's armed formations and mercenaries in 137 areas. And so, to your earlier point about expanding or widening the aperture here, they seem to be turning the heat up.
Yeah. So one thing that said that these long-range drone strikes, using again the Garan, which is an evolution, a locally produced version of the Iranian Shahed 136. And a much more advanced evolution of it, a couple of years into its use, must be said. They're occurring on an essentially a nightly basis at this point, right? They're occurring, some 137 in one night is I would say a higher than average number, but you can expect, around 50 flying every night, at a bare minimum. The Kiev regime responds with long-range drone strikes, generally once or twice a week. That they're able to follow through on that. One of the primary differences being there is that the Russian drones seem considerably more advanced, and
more advanced than
the Kiev regime's drones.
Oh, okay.
And also, and more advanced than Russia's own were at the beginning of this conflict, evolution of the combat systems. But also, Russia has extremely effective air defense and electronic warfare systems to deal with them. And the Kiev regime at this point, those systems are either non-existent in much of the country or extremely deteriorated, even in, places like Kiev or Kharkov or Odessa. So these are occurring on a regular thing. But in general, if it started out with this conflict with one foot in the technology and methodology of war of the last century, we've now pretty much strode into, what for most people you might consider a future war, right? While at the beginning of this conflict, right, artillery was the king of the battlefield, right? As the maxim goes, and there's no question. And artillery is still important. It still plays a role. So it's often assisted in targeting with drones. But this has become a drone conflict, right? Drones are present in all factors of this conflict, whether we're talking reconnaissance and intelligence, whether we're talking electronic warfare, whether we're talking these FPV strike drones used to hit vehicles and personnel, or whether we're talking these longer range systems going after, military industrial centers, energy centers, and the like, going after artillery pieces, going after, tanks, you name it. Drones are being used for everything. And they're being used on both sides very extensively. And there is a huge evolution in these drones and both in the means to counter them going on. Russia has long, in the last half a year or so, Russia has switched to a very high use of fiber optic cable drones, right? These are drones that are literally attached and controlled through a minuscule fiber optic cable, which just seems fantastical, but it makes them immune to any type of electronic warfare jamming. And I've seen pictures of basically one of the battlefields looking up and seeing like a spider network of webs when the light catches it the right way, of dozens and dozens, hundreds of fiber optic cables arching over the sky, each one attached to a drone that is out there hunting targets.
And what's it attached to on the ground end?
It is attached to an operator who is controlling it.
And how long of a cable?
Very long, very thin.
Well, see, I worked for the phone company for 23 years, and I remember when fiber optic technology was introduced to the consumer. And so I'm trying to imagine this very thin strand of glass.
Yeah.
That
a couple kilometers long. Yep, that's what we're looking at.
Wow.
And they're produced in, the Kiev regime is producing drones. So that has to be said, right? A lot of what they get is parts and stuff from China, actually, sometimes bought up by Western countries and supplied it. And they're still doing what I would consider an admirable job with the destruction of most of their military industrial complex, of having transitioned basically to small workshops, often literally underground. But Russia is producing drones at an industrial level, right? Russia is producing millions. We're talking up to 10 million drones every month.
What?
Yes, that is the level of drones that are being used in this conflict. Again, a lot of them are reconnaissance drones, these one-shot FPV drones, but this is a drone war. And for every drone that you launch, like an FPV drone, maybe only 1 or 2 out of 10 will actually get through, right? Will reach a target. I've seen the Russian military, particularly those electronic warfare forces, often take pictures of themselves next to giant mountains of drones that they have brought down with electronic warfare that are much taller than they are. And they're like, yeah, this was from the front, one area of the front line today. So according to Russia's the statistics that have come out of Russia right now, 73% of all casualties, meaning dead and wounded, right, of Russian personnel now come as a result of drones. 73%. 20% are still a result of artillery, and only 4% come from small arms fire, which means guns. 4%, right? The vast majority is drones. Now, it has to be said that these numbers are probably a little skewed on the Russian casualty side because the Kiev regime simply doesn't have much artillery and other long-range strike methods. I would, so they have to rely more on the drones. Ukrainian casualty numbers are probably not quite 73% skewed towards drone casualties, but I would guess that it's still probably higher than 50, which demonstrates how much of a drone war this has become. In fact, both sides are now lining their roads used for logistics with essentially giant net fences, right, on three sides. They're covering over their roads to protect their supply vehicles. Over just entire roads, just covered with fenced netting to prevent drones from doing that. And there are entire engineering units whose only job is to maintain and to extend these net protected roads.
So that's amazing. That takes me to, so where are we now with any level of negotiation to bring this thing to an end? TASS reports Russia, U.S., Ukraine talks continue as Iranian, U.S., Oman meeting makes headlines. In comparison to a truce, a political resolution is a more intricate and prolonged endeavor. For this, not only must Moscow and Washington align, but also the Europeans and NATO. The matter of the new framework of European security must be addressed. Bilateral and multilateral agreements must be developed, and all of this must be somehow palatable to Kiev. But this doesn't align with Trump's approach, which favors straightforward, clear solutions. That's Andrei Kortunov, an expert with the Valdai Discussion Club. So what this sounds like to me is Russia is saying what Russia has been saying from the very beginning. This is not a matter of a ceasefire. This is a matter of solving this issue. And that does not sound like what the United States is trying to put on the table.
Yeah. So primarily the Trump administration wants a ceasefire because it wants to save its proxy Kiev regime, right? And it realizes how bad the situation on the battlefield is right now. Russia has no interest in a ceasefire that comes before a permanent settlement on their terms, because previously we have seen such ceasefires. Right. There was Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. Which, Russia and the European countries agreed to. And then later we heard from the French, the German, and the Kiev regime leaders that we never intended, that they were only used to buy time to build up a powerful Ukrainian military, send them weapons, and forcibly conscript more troops. And similarly, the Istanbul communique in the beginning of this, these talks about a peace settlement right after the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict had begun in 2022, was similarly just a play for time, right? Until Western weapons arrived and the conscription began. So Russia's not going to be fooled, well, a fourth time, shall we say. So like they say, no ceasefire until we have at least a framework for an agreement, right, with the intention that it be followed through and legally codified by the United States, by the Kiev regime, and eventually the Europeans would have to be brought in. And it has to be said, the Europeans do not want any ceasefire. They do not want any peace settlement. Peace settlement. They want to continue the war because they can't accept the results as they stand now. Similarly, the Kiev regime can't accept the results.
Wait a minute. To that point of their inability to accept the results as they exist now.
On the battlefield.
Right. Basically, they can't afford to have Russia win.
Yes.
Is that because they've been reading their own press clippings and are now becoming victimized by their own what's the word I'm looking for? Their own
propaganda.
Propaganda. Thank you. My interpreter, Mark Sleboda. So are they now victims and believers of their own propaganda, which is and that meaning, for those that wonder what I'm talking about, that this is only the first stop for Russia. It's Ukraine first, it's France second, and Cleveland is the ultimate objective.
Yeah, I don't think they actually seriously believe that, but there's no question in their, shall we say, endless and often baseless and propagandistic criticism of the Russian military and blowing up out of all proportion the Kiev regime forces, that they've been drinking their own Kool-Aid, right?
So one more question then. Is it not that they've been drinking their own Kool-Aid and believing their own propaganda? It's that if they settle this now in the manner in which Russia is demanding, then how do they turn to their people and say, well, we know we've been telling you that Russia was eventually going to take over Cleveland. We know that, but we've decided that, how do they then explain this to their own people who have been believing this propaganda? How about that?
Yeah, it's both. I think it's and more, right? It's a matter of having to deal with drinking through their own propaganda Kool-Aid, and do they believe it, and they believe this is a stalemate, and all of this other nonsense that's put out in the Western media on a regular basis. Russians fighting with shovels, running out of tanks, missiles. The same it's been for the last 3 years. Yeah,
they've been launching washing machines.
But yes, there's also a question of domestic political responsibility to the publics that elect them, and how much political capital they've invested in here. It's also a question of simply not willing to accept the geopolitical results of this conflict, which is, it's a defeat of NATO and the United States, right? The U.S. Secretary of State has admitted, Marco Rubio, that this was a proxy war fought against Russia in Ukraine. The New York Times just had a lengthy piece, and in between the propaganda is an admission of how deeply involved the U.S. was in everything from the strategic to the operational down to the tactical level, right? On the battlefield, which fortification over which hill, and the like, and was an instrumental part of the kill chain, right, for the last few years. So the U.S. is, if they haven't lost this war yet, they're well on their way to losing it. The Europeans simply can't accept that, right? They I believe ideologically, they are exceptionalists, right? In the same way we talk about American exceptionalism, the current European foreign and political elite believe in Western exceptionalism, or if you want to call it European. They can't accept losing to Russia, a country that they regularly deride as Nigeria with snow or a gas station. It challenges their conception of their own identity, of their place in the world, as they believe they are systemically, societally, and morally superior to Russia and to every other country that's not a part of the West in the rest of the world. This is this whole garden jungle rhetoric coming out of Borrell and other European technocrat officials, which is really just book titles cribbed from Robert Kagan, the arch neocon of the United States. I would go so far to say is that the American neocons have long since mentally colonized this generation of European foreign policy and political elite. And they can't accept losing to Russia. And they're afraid it would mean the end of US-led Western global hegemony, which the Europeans seem much more dedicated to at this moment than the current U.S. administration, it must be said.
And I've said this a number of times before, but I think it bears repeating here, and that is here in the West, particularly in the United States, because we don't understand geography and we don't understand geopolitics, we see Russia as being a part of Europe, and I know, but trust me on this one, Mark. and also, and I've heard this from many people. This is a fight between white folks. This is white folks fighting white folks, and people don't understand that Europe does not view Russia as part of Europe, and that
Russia doesn't view itself as part of Europe.
Correct. But I put it in the former for this reason, because the Europeans see the Russians as Slavs. They see them as lesser than. They don't see them on, to your point. But I wanted to make the point that this is almost a racist mindset.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That we're dealing with here. This is not a fight over territory and borders. This is a racist issue.
Yeah, and it has to be said that issue of race has been so prevalent in the Kiev regime's Banderite fascist ideology dating back to World War II and brought forward today. First of all, Russia is much larger than all of Europe. It's 1/6 of the land surface, right? And there are over 200 just indigenous ethnicities in Russia, and many of them don't look like me. They don't look like Slavs, right? You know, this constant.
We've captured North Koreans.
Yeah, North Koreans, Chinese, Iranians, Martians. You know, all of these people that the Kiev regime is fighting them. They, you know, never mind that someone from Tuva has an Asian appearance, right? For those who consider that all Alasians look alike, like all other, you know, skin color people of your choice look alike. Okay, well that's incredibly racist, and there's no real evidence of North Korean troops fighting, much less, you know, anything more than a few dozen Chinese volunteers. And it must be said, there's actually Chinese volunteers fighting on both sides of this conflict. There are some Chinese volunteers fighting for the Kiev regime in Ukraine. God knows why, but I mean there are. So I mean that's the situation there. But I mean the Europeans, as far as Russia is concerned, at least the current administration, and the thinking that has to be said is becoming more and more prevalent throughout, you know, Eurasia, is that Europe is some podunk little peninsula off the coast of the Eurasian continent, right? That once dominated the world with colonialism, imperialism, but those days are long over. And while I would say that during the 90s, there was a moment where Russians genuinely aspired to be part of Europe, to be part of a European community, part of a European security architecture. Those days
they wanted to be part of NATO.
They wanted to be part of NATO. That's the security architecture. But those days are long since past. And maybe one of the most definitive results of this conflict and the years leading up to it since 2014 is that Russians no longer look at Europe and the United States with the old white god complex.
You said time leading up to this since 2014. Why did you select 2014 and not go back to, what is it, 2001 when or two with the reunification of Germany?
So Well, I mean, the reason I mentioned 2014 was because it was the date of the West-backed Maidan Putsch overthrowing the last legitimate democratically elected government.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay,
but we could take it back to 2008 with the NATO Bucharest declaration that one day, whether they want to or not, Ukraine and Georgia would become a part of NATO. We could take it back to the beginning of the color revolutions in Georgia, in Ukraine in the early 2000s. We could take it back to the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the U.S. launched Operation Red Sox, which the CIA led an insurgency on the ground in Ukraine of former Ukrainian Waffen-SS veterans that they hoped to overthrow the Soviet government in Ukraine, which was a dramatic failure. This is something that's left out of U.S. history books. But by the way, there's actually a fairly comprehensive article on it in the recent years by Politico. Operation Red Sox. If you want to know what started the Cold War, that's a good look. If you want to lead this is why I say that this conflict has happened before. The West has supported Banderite fascists in Ukraine, back in the early 1950s, and they're doing it once again today. And unfortunately, there's every possibility we'll see this again in the future.
I was thinking of the Jim Baker Gorbachev conversation. That's what I was getting.
There's all points of it started here, right?
Okay.
You can do that all along.
Just a couple of other things. So this one I think is very. In fact, if you can give me just a couple more minutes, I've read for a while that naval warfare is changing, and that is it has shifted away from the dominant aircraft carrier model to submarine warfare. And there's an article in, I think, Sputnik. Why are Russia's Condor subs a pain in the neck for enemy fleets? And you can take that anywhere you want to in terms of the shift. So go ahead, Mark Sleboda.
Okay, so first of all, let me put it right out there is that while they're in the current conflict in Ukraine, while there has been some naval activity in the Black Sea, that is only a footnote to this conflict, right? This is a land conflict, and that's not important. But there has still been an evolution, and we've seen it, and that will become incredibly important in big naval engagements in the future, particularly any U.S. provocation of China off the Taiwanese Straits or in the South China Sea. That will be a naval conflict, right? Fought with naval forces, drones, missiles, right? Almost in its entirety, right? We're seeing an evolution away from big, expensive, vulnerable ships like the aircraft carrier to smaller ships, to submarines, but also I would argue increasingly we're seeing how important drones and missiles will be to future naval conflict, right? There was in the days leading up to the decade leading up to World War II, there was a transition away from the battleship, right? And then there were decades of the domination of the aircraft carrier. The conflicts of the future, the naval conflicts of the future will be fought primarily with submarines, but also with drones and missiles, right? That's where the conflict is. Naval conflict is evolving to. Underwater drones, underwater carrier drones, right? Nuclear powered underwater drones. I mean, we're really in the realm of science fiction becoming reality. And of course, absolutely none of these evolutions, whether we're talking drones, AI, nuclear power, this and that, is covered by any types of arms control agreements. The old Cold War arms control architecture having been pulled out of and abandoned by the U.S. in the last couple of decades, almost without exception. And there's no agreed upon rules of these evolving arms of the future. And, we've all seen enough sci-fi shows to know that this ends in Skynet.
And a couple of points that I found interesting about this Condor sub is, one, that the hull is made of titanium. And so as a titanium hull, it's lighter, it's faster, it's more maneuverable, but also it's anti-magnetic, which means it's harder to detect with radar. Yes. So as, again, following some of this development of submarine technology, the stealthiness of the sub had to do, to a great degree, with how quiet it ran.
Yes.
So that it wouldn't be detected by sonar. But now you have this titanium hull that's anti-magnetic, and so this thing can't even be picked up by radar.
Which means when it surfaces, say, for instance, to fire cruise missiles or to release drones or something of the like, it's harder to detect in that process.
Man. And we don't have, from what I understand, anything like it.
I'm a former U.S. Navy guy, right? Full disclosure, a veteran in the nuclear engineering field in the U.S. Navy. I would venture to say
wait a minute, folks. That means he's smart as hell. That's what that means. This is a really smart guy.
That means. I do the job Homer Simpson did, so don't blow it out of proportion.
Okay, Homer. Go ahead, Homer.
All right, so I would venture to say that while the U.S. maintains that strength advantage with some of its naval assets, like the aircraft carriers, right? Russia has one barely operable aircraft carrier at this point. It's really the Kuznetsov. It's kind of a bad joke, to be perfectly honest. But Russian submarines are what they have focused on in the last decade plus, and
China as well, isn't it?
China is advancing in everything, and China's shipbuilding capacity is hundreds of times what the U.S. is. Hundreds of times what the U.S. And this has been openly admitted by everyone involved. So wherever Russia is going, China is going in a bigger way, in a much broader scope. Simply because of the scale of the population and economy that is open to them. Russia has less than one half the population of the United States, and the United States has a third of the population of China, to put that into perspective.
Final question for you, switching continents and moving over to Iran. Also, first of all, the story today about the IDF striking the final serviceable hospital in Gaza is just horrific. Targeting hospitals. But this, where we are now with still Donald Trump having this brilliant idea that it's a good idea to strike Iran, talking about Iran has to come to understand that they cannot have a nuclear missile. Donald Trump seems to not understand they aren't trying to get one.
Okay, so first of all, this rhetoric, right? U.S. intelligence has openly and publicly concurred again that Iran does not have and has not had in decades at this point a nuclear weapons program. They have a civilian nuclear program, which they are entitled to under international law, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they enrich uranium for them. By default, that then gives them what is considered breakout technology, meaning that if they have missiles, they have enriched uranium, if they felt, say, the deterrent need to build nuclear weapons, they could do so in fairly short order. But there's absolutely nothing illegal about it, and the U.S. has no legal or moral right to demand that. And I suspect it's actually about far more than that. I suspect that the real issue is actually that the Americans and the Israelis want, well, first of all, the Israelis just want war. They want America to wipe out Iran for them. That's Netanyahu's ultimate goal. But the U.S., I believe, is using these talks as screen, because what they really want to force on the Iranians is to stop all support for all Shia military groups, the axis of resistance in the Middle East. The Houthis are on Salah in Yemen, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, you name it and shake it. There's quite a significant network there. And this is part of Donald Trump's Israel first foreign policy. I mean, he has given the open and public green light for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians out of Palestine, Gaza, and beyond, and then we'll turn it into a resort. And some people will be invited back to live there, but not the Palestinians. I mean, they're pretty open about that. With Iran, it has to be said that, of course, the Iranians don't trust the Americans, because it was Donald Trump that ripped up the previous nuclear deal that they had with the Obama administration, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, for no other reason than apparently it was Obama's signature foreign policy legacy, quote unquote. And it was Trump who ordered the assassination in Iraq, right, by Reaper drones of Qasem Soleimani, then the head of Iran's IRGC. And a very popular, the man could have been Iran's president right now, right? If he had
Soleimani,
absolutely.
Oh God, yes. Oh,
he had a political course ahead of him. He was incredibly charismatic and popular. At one point, even the U.S. admitted that Iranian Soleimani-led forces were instrumental to the defeat of ISIS in Iraq. Even the United States mentioned that at one point.
I was in Iran in 2017 for the celebration of the revolution. And I'm standing with my interpreter on a corner in Tehran. And this guy comes out of nowhere. And he's in uniform and he walks right in front of me. And everybody went nuts. It was Elvis, John Lennon, and Michael Jackson all in one, breaking out in song. And I turned to my interpreter. I said, and my interpreter Ali, he was beside himself. And I said, man, what's going on? He said, it's General Soleimani. It's General Soleimani. I had no idea who Soleimani was, but I bent down to my bag to get my camera. And when I came up to take the camera shot, he was gone. And I said, Ali, where'd he go? He said, he disappears. That's why they call him the ghost.
He was a lion, and it must be said the Russian military and the Kremlin had a great deal of respect from working alongside him in Syria.
This guy was the man.
Anyway, so that's why Iran doesn't trust the United States. But it must be said, I don't believe that Iran doesn't want a war with the United States. And at the moment, I don't think the Trump administration wants a war, another war in the Middle East to get dragged in.
This is the one thing.
Trump wants to pivot to China. He wants to deal with Asia. He's got his own domestic political war against the deep state in the United States. He's got his tariff wars. He doesn't want a war in the Middle East. And it has to be said that right now, the U.S.'s Achilles heel is that it doesn't have enough air defense missiles or missiles, right? It has very low production rates of them. The military industrial complex is way behind. They've wasted far too many of them in Ukraine. Also, once again, playing whack-a-mole against the Houthis in the deserts of Yemen, wasting both air defense and strike missiles. And Iran has very significant advanced long-range strike capabilities in terms of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, supposedly even hypersonic missiles, drones. the U.S. can't defend its network of military bases in the Middle East, much less Israel, if that conflict breaks out. So I think that I would say 80% of Trump right now is bluster, trying to force a deal. And the Iranians might just go along with it because right now they've just signed a new strategic partnership, a deeper, more improved strategic partnership with Russia. And it's generally assessed that Russia, part of that is that Russia is building them a conventional deterrent, a air defense and electronic warfare network, which means that they won't need a nuclear weapon to defend themselves from U.S. and Israeli attack. However, that's something that will take a couple years, 2-3 years at the minimum to build. So Iran will probably look to cut a deal at the moment now too, simply to buy time for themselves to build up their defenses in the short to medium term future.
Phenomenal, man. As always, Mark Sleboda, thank you so much for your time. I'm glad we were finally able to get our calendars in sync. And man, this just let me know how much I truly miss talking with you. And I truly, truly appreciate it, Mark. Thank you.
It is absolutely reciprocal.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Folks,
you as well.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. Please follow and subscribe. Leave a review. Share the show. You can follow us on social media. You can follow the links below. We need, of course, those of you that are watching to subscribe to us through the YouTube channel. Thank you for your contributions to Patreon and continue to do so, please, because we need that support. We are doing this for you, but we cannot do this without you. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.